Brendan Gleeson, from your point of view, key priorities for CAP post-2000?
Yeah, well, thanks, Anya. Well, I was very interested to listen to the Commissioner's presentation there, and I suppose
You've an easy job ahead of you, really, don't you?
Well, I think what we have now is a framework we can work with for the next few years. I suppose the important thing is that this CAP communication is just the first step in a process that's going to take several years. And really, while there's a set of principles articulated with which we see many elements of Irish policy, the devil will be in the detail. So I suppose the key theme in this particular one is subsidiarity, more discretion for member states to design a CAP that suits their local conditions. And we've been strong proponents of this for many years, and we have a European Union that stretches from Cyprus to the Arctic Circle. Farm conditions are not the same in every member state. So we're supportive of that concept. Of course, there are risks with it. I think there's a risk of added complexity. So as member states, we're going to have to be extremely careful to design systems that are easily implemented. And I suppose the second big theme here is simplification. That's a big theme in every CAP reform. It's easier said than done. And the key thing about simplification, it has to be simpler for everybody to administer. So, for example, from the point of view of the Commission, the consolidation of regulations might make things simpler. It mightn't change anything for farmers on the ground. So we want to make sure that if there's simplification, it's simpler for the Commission to administer, it's simpler for the Department to administer, and it makes a real difference for people on the ground. I suppose the other elements we're glad to see in the paper are a continued commitment to direct payments. Because one of the characteristics of agricultural markets in recent years is extreme volatility. Now, there are multiple tools that you can use to deal with volatility, but from our perspective, we think that direct payments at least provide a measure of certainty for farmers in the income that they receive every year. But it won't be enough on its own. It has to be supplemented by interventions at European Union level, by private sector instruments maybe like futures markets, certainly by longer term contracts for farmer suppliers. So again, we're glad to see that in there in the CAP communication. The third element that we're very glad to see in there is a commitment to do something about generational change. And we know that the average age of farmers in Ireland is 57. And we know, as a result of surveys, that many farmers haven't identified a successor, for example. So again, we're very glad to see that in there. It's important. Commitment to smarter CAP investment, making the system through the supply chain more competitive, because we're moving into an era of more liberalised trade globally, and the reality is we have to be able to deal and compete at world market price levels, and we have to be able to do that. And I think the other thing, and the Commissioner made it a major feature of his contribution there, is, we have to do a little bit more for the environment. It's important to recognise, I think, that...
It sounded like he was talking about a little bit more than a little bit more.
No. Well, sure. Well, I think there are two things about this. One is that it has to be recognised what the agri-food sector has done in terms of environmental sustainability over the last few years. So in the period from 2009 to 2015, emissions have actually diminished from the agriculture sector, which is a remarkable achievement in the light of the increased productivity. But they've started to climb again now because we have an ambitious growth programme. So we can't allow that to happen, and we can't allow a kind of a negative association to develop between food, agri-food, and the environment. So really, the next CAP is going to have to help us underpin farmer and industry efforts to improve that situation. So I think we have a document there that we can work with. The devil is in the detail, because you really need no more than the Brexit discussions today. Yeah. Some principles will be established, but then we'll get into, in the trade element, article by article assessment of what it means for us, and it'll be the same with this CAP review.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Let's hear from, if you like, from the farmers, a reaction to the Commissioner's speech, and again what he was talking about in terms of the CAP reform, and particularly subsidiarity and sustainability. Does it freak you out? Do you look forward to it?
No, but by and large I welcomed an awful lot of what the Commissioner had to say this morning. A lot of it has been kite flying for the last number of months, so we had a line of sight of what was potentially going to be in it. you know, the title of the conference is Challenges, Ambition and Opportunities. And we would share the ambition for sure. We'd share the ambition for the continent. But from the perspective of the primary producer whom I represent, and I've had the discussion with the Commissioner on numerous occasions, first of all, we have to make sure that we get the budget, because unless we have got it, we can't spend it. The Commissioner, I'm not so sure, was forceful enough in terms of justifying the budget as being good value for money for the taxpayers of Europe. It is only 1% of the GDP of Europe. It certainly, in my view, would be as much a consumer subsidy as a farmer subsidy, and we've got to say that. We've got to say that it pays back in spades for the taxpayer in terms of a safe, secure supply of sustainable food. But just one of the little details.
The reality is, though, you know, there's likely to be less in the big pot overall.
Well, I wouldn't accept that as a reality. The reality is, for now, as an industry and as a commission, we have to justify the cap to the taxpayer. And we have to acknowledge up front it's taxpayers' money. We've got to be able to justify it to them and tell them that they're getting a good bang for their buck. Just to go back to when we put the budget to rest, the Commissioner referred to market orientation and market-orientated policy. There's an issue, and I accept that he acknowledged that, first of all, the farmer has to be as efficient as he or she can possibly be in order to mitigate climate change. And as an industry, we accept that there is a climate issue that has to be dealt with in a pragmatic fashion. Secondly, national government has absolutely got to provide primary producers who are so vulnerable to volatility with tools in terms of the tax variance and the tax code.
Okay.
But finally, and the final point, what the Commissioner didn't address for me adequately is market orientation will never work for food. There's a 3-year lead-in, and the Commissioner, with his infinite wisdom, cannot tell us as farmers where the market is going to be in 3 years' time. Take 9 months gestation for the animal, 2 years for it to grow, to come into the milking parlour. So there's got to be mitigation and there's got to be tools in place. And what we see, to get the market in balance, the Commission has got to put on a permanent legislative footing a milk reduction, volume reduction scheme. Because, and the final point is, this is the bit that he missed in the jigsaw. When a farmer has all the fixed costs incurred, you compound the problem. He said milk production has gone up across Europe and the price is coming down. He's absolutely right, because the farmers have all the fixed costs incurred, so they have to keep milking, so they're on the treadmill. We can't just switch off once the investments are made, and that's the key point that the Commissioner missed, I think.
All right, and I'll come back to that point about market orientation never working for food in a moment. But Joe Healy, I mean, the fact of the matter is, no matter what farm organisations say, the EU is going to have a smaller overall budget. CAP takes 40% of that budget, and farmers are going to have to fight a lot harder, aren't they, to get their share of that?
Yes, we are, but in relation to the overall budget, we must remember that the last time the CAP reform, the European Union, the economies of the European Union were on the way down. This one is against the backdrop of a rising EU economy. 1% of a rising economy should give more to a budget than 1% of a falling economy. And, you know, as has been pointed out already, the CAP has been very good to the 500 million European consumers. If we go back to when CAP was introduced in the 1960s, 30% of the average household income was being spent on food. The food we're producing today is of a far better quality, produced to much higher standards, traceable from farm to fork, and there's only about 10 to 12% of the average household income being spent on food. And I think that's maybe a message that's lost to the wider community, because when people look at CAP, they immediately think of a benefit for farmers. CAP has been good to the whole community. So I think it's all about funding the next time. And we've met with Commissioner Oettinger and proposed to him that the Member States' contribution should be increased from 1% to 1.1%. And allied to that, any new initiatives, whether it's around security or defence or whatever else, it needs to be new money for that. The CAP budget can't be raided because, you know, we have, and again, it has been mentioned that, and I think it was John Horgan, what we have invested as farmers and processors into producing a food for a market, that has to be returned to us. And like, there are the number of challenges. There's CAP, there's Mercosur, there's Brexit, there's the food chain. If we look at the food chain across Europe and the farmers take from the final price and you take in all the different commodities, the farmer gets 21%. The processor 28% and the retailer 51%. We need, and I welcome the Commissioner Hogan's Agri-Markets Task Force report, but we need to build on that. We also need to look at agriculture as an attractive industry. We can't continue with an industry that right across Europe, including here in Ireland, we've less than 6% of our farmers under the age of 35. Labour is another issue. But farm incomes. Okay. We have an average farm income.
So it's going to be about the size of the pot and also then the division within the pot, particularly if there's more subsidiarity coming back to the member state. Carmel, from the point of view of the OECD, you know, we're hearing a lot about opportunities, we're hearing a lot about challenges, and we're hearing a lot about volatility. Is there anything from your perspective, if you like, you know, that more global perspective, that you'd like to bring into your response to what the Commissioner said?
Well, particularly on the question of volatility, this is really a very difficult one. So across our member countries, we see several countries that have very elaborate and very complex systems in place that actually do deal with volatility. And it is possible to do so. But maybe the real question is it possible to deal with volatility without it being immensely costly, without it doing things that will crowd out private, individual or market mechanisms that farmers would otherwise use? Is it possible to deal with volatility or remove volatility and not also stifle adjustment or mask market signals or prevent farmers from actually making the innovations that they might need to make in order to deal with what's going out there in terms of the markets? Because the markets are changing and the farmers need to be able to see. They need to have sight of what's going on in the markets.
And as a general point, you know, the view that market, there's all this focus on the markets on the one hand, but on the other hand, food production inevitably needs certainties and supports. Just addressing that point of view. So
ideally, this ideal world doesn't exist, by the way, because if the question you had asked me, if you had asked me, you know, what country is doing this perfectly, I'd have said none. There isn't anybody doing it perfectly. But in an ideal world, you would have, first of all, you would have a culture of risk, whereby farmers themselves, through diversification, savings, perhaps using the tax system if that's available to them, would be dealing with a certain amount of normal business risk. That would be the first thing. Then there would be another layer which would be amenable to somehow market mechanisms. So that might be insurance, but not usually multi-risk insurance, because there is no example in the whole world of a commercial multi-risk insurance. There are always subsidies, but there are commercial subsidized. There are commercial insurances for some kinds of risks. There's futures markets, there's all sorts of forward contracting and all sorts of things that belong in the realm of the market that farmers have access to or could have access to if the arrangements and the institutions were there. And then there's clearly a layer of risk where it's appropriate for the government to come in, because the risk, the damage is very deep, because it's systemic, etc. So what's important there is that, again, that farmers have some kind of certainty or sight of what's going to happen. So ideally, a government will say in advance, this is the kind of risk that we're willing to insure, might be the word, or that we're willing to take care of, and we're going to do so on these terms. Because, again, what you see throughout the OECD world is an awful lot of ad hoc types of interventions, and if the interventions are ad hoc, the farmers will always know that the government will step in, and that will actually prevent them or prevent the development of the market instruments that would otherwise have developed. So you have to see it as this sort of layered system, stacked system, where different actors take responsibility for different parts of the problem.
And Brendan, from your point of view, because more is going to be devolved back to the member state in terms of subsidiarity, you're looking for that simplicity, you're looking for the agri-food sector to be market orientated. But how do you deal with the fact as well that farmers need certainty? The timelines are so long, they can't just be ducking and diving and throwing one thing out the window because they've too much money tied up in it.
Yeah, well, and in a way, Carmel has hit the nail on the head. So, I mean, we have a budget of about 1.8 billion annually from the European Union to deal with farmers, and it's a question of choices about how we use that funding. So our position has always been that direct payments are a measure of stability for farmers. They're an absolute certain piece of income that will come in the door every year. It's not responsive to volatility, but at least it provides some measure of stability. Ireland and Irish industry has been a kind of a world leader in terms of developing its own instruments. So we have, over the last few years, had longer-term supply contracts. We've had loan schemes and a variety of other private sector instruments that have worked reasonably well for at least a portion of the production of farmers. And then we do need this safety net at European Union level. So, I mean, intervention gets a bad press. We certainly have no interest in going back to the days of large volumes of stock in storage and overhanging the market, because that has its own implications for market. But you do need some kind of a safety net instrument there. We had the option the last time around, in the last version of CAP, to look at risk management instruments, things like insurance, mutual funds, income stability mechanisms. Very few member states took them up because the conditions were quite rigid. They only kicked in when somebody had lost more than 30% of their income, and then you could only come a portion of the way back up. So the question as to whether it was best use of the funding we had available arose in those circumstances. Next time around, I think we'll have a little bit more flexibility, but it will still come down to choices about how you make the best use of the funding provided at the European Union level. And we'll have a lot of thinking to do about that, and we'll have a lot of thinking to do with the sector about that. Because what it wants for itself will have a significant influence in what we produce at the end of the day.
And as farm representatives, there are going to be tough choices ahead for you guys, because somebody's going to suffer more pain than some other person. Somebody else is going to gain a little bit more inevitably as these changes are brought in. Are you prepared for that?
Yeah, certainly we're prepared for that, but as best you can be. But the reality is there's about, give or take, a few litres, about 160 billion litres of milk produced in Europe annually. And a percentage up and down has the ability or the capacity to double or half the milk price. That's the vulnerability. I think we've got enough elected representatives to mitigate, rather than bringing in a PLC, which would be an insurance company, and just takes another portion of the money away that gets down to the primary producer. My point would be I would always contend the vulnerable players in the food chain is the farmer as the primary producer, because they have nobody to pass it back to, and the consumer as the end person that is paying for the food. So we've got to get the balance right. The Commission has got to put tools at the disposal of the primary producers that will get the balance between supply and demand correct. Because if it goes one way, the consumer suffers, and if it goes the other way, the farmer suffers.
You would agree, Joe?
Yes, I do, but I think that, the conversation is dwelling a lot on CAP, and rightly so. But I think, as the Commissioner said, no farmers, no food. The farmers are the boots on the ground. And another area that, while we welcome the work and the early soundings on CAP, but I think another area that's very pertinent at the moment is the whole area of Mercosur. And there's no point in delivering a favourable CAP if you're going to undermine it by allowing cheaper foreign product from South American countries, not produced to the standards that we're producing here. It's not a level playing field. And I think it's irresponsible to be talking about a deal with Mercosur that will dwarf and drown the European market. We're already 102% self-sufficient for beef. Post-Brexit, that increases to 116%. We were in Brussels during the week, and we met a good few people from DG Trade in relation to Mercosur. If they're talking about 70,000 extra tonnes into a market where consumption is falling and we're over self-sufficient, that's irresponsible, and it's going to decimate the beef trade.
Okay, a lot of support for you in the audience on that, and indeed the Commissioner was talking about playing a good defence line on that. But Brendan, one of the difficulties, isn't it? And I mean, one way or another, trade agreements are going to feature quite heavily over the next couple of years. So it's the cherry picking aspect, isn't it? You know, we're delighted with trade agreements when they suit us, but if it's Mercosur and it's going to be hurtful for us, well, we don't like that. And small countries like Ireland, inevitably, are there compromises?
Well, a couple of things, I suppose, Anya. First, Ireland is pro-trade. We have to be. We're a small, open economy, nowhere more so than in the agri-food sector. So we're pro-trade. We've never said we're against a Mercosur deal. I don't think we're cherry-picking. But all trade agreements are negotiated on the basis of a balance of interests. And that's the way it's done, and we make no apology for that. In fact, we'd be unique if we entered into this with some principled approach rather than pragmatism and protecting some level of our own interests. In Europe, we have explicitly decided to support a system, particularly in the beef sector, where we have family farms and that produce food to a very high standard, no hormones, high standards of traceability, and there's a price to pay for that. And it does mean that it makes it difficult to compete with large countries that have different farm structures, different standards. That's the reality. So when it comes to Mercosur, I suppose we make absolutely no apology for negotiating to protect the best interests of our own sectors. And the beef sector is clearly a vulnerable sector, but everybody does that. That's the way trade negotiations are conducted. So as members of the European Union, we're party to between 60 and 70 trade agreements, all of which represent the balance of interests between the negotiators in every single one of those. And we have significant TRQs already that allow the importation of beef into the European Union, and we manage that. But there's a particular vulnerability here that we're very sensitive to. And yes, we are negotiating to protect the best interests of one of our really important sectors when it comes to this agreement.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. Carmel, you wanted to come in there.
Well, Brendan said a lot of the things that I would have said. But it's exactly right that trade agreements are about balance of interests. And of course, Ireland or any other country within the EU will work hard to protect its own interests. But what I see, I know I sound like I'm here, but I'm not. I've lived in Paris for 30 years. And looking at it a bit from the outside, I mean, what I see is an Irish agriculture and agri-food sector that looks to me to be extraordinarily dynamic, gung-ho, out there, with very strong offensive interests, doing extremely well, learning to do that branding, defining ourselves as different because of the conditions under which our products are produced and all of those things. So it looks to me like Ireland should continue to be offensive in that way, because if Ireland, with our conditions, our climate, our reputation, you know, isn't able to go there and keep and develop the market share, well, I mean, I think you can. I really think you can. So,
but I suppose before I bring in some people from the audience, we've enjoyed, you know, whatever the ups and downs, we're able now to look back and say we've had a couple of decades of, you know, enormous stability. Whatever happens in the next decade and the next 15 years, certainly we're going to get an awful lot of volatility on a number of fronts all at once. So I suppose, you know, that's maybe why people within the system are feeling a bit nervous right now.
yeah. But as Brendan said, I mean, the current system, without being counter-cyclical in nature, actually provides very significant stability through the direct payment system. The choice, and it's a difficult choice, that's facing the European Union, facing governments as they deal with the subsidiarity that they will get under this new version of the CAP, will be to what extent you want that to be your system. So your income support system and is doubling, as it were, as a risk management system, or whether you really want to develop risk management systems that respond specifically to the volatility and maybe are directed at, let's say, a more commercial type of farm and less likely to be used and indeed less needed by, let's say, the kind of part-time farmer who has other income sources and that kind of thing. So I think there will really be some very significant choices that are going to have to be made in that domain in the coming years. But if the fear is volatility coming from those markets adversely affecting the commercial farmers, then I would say that maybe you do need to begin to move some of the available budget towards measures that are more purely risk management and not income support.